Good morning, RBC. I know I said I'd be away this week, and I am, but thanks to the magic of technology, I can bring you this morning's welcome and announcements. So welcome to Worship with RBC. We are so glad to have you here. We have a few announcements this week. The first is that tomorrow, Monday night at 7:30, our prayer group will meet via Zoom. All are welcome to join us for this brief time of prayer together. So that's tomorrow at 7:30. You can use the same Zoom link that you use to go into worship. On Wednesday at 7:30, our missional book group that has been reading Surprise the World by Michael Frost will meet with our global servant, Bruce Borquist from New Zealand, also on Zoom. If you haven't joined our sessions before, or even if you haven't read the book, I invite you to join us for this time together as we've been having really rich and wonderful conversations about mission and ministry in the world today. So again, that's Wednesday at 7:30 on Zoom. Finally, today at 10:30, immediately following the broadcast of this worship live, I invite you to join your fellow RBCers and friends on Zoom for a time of online fellowship and a post-worship Q&A time with our guest preacher today, Reverend Ray Schellinger. You can use our regular Zoom link that we use for worship and various meetings, and that will be immediately following the live broadcast of this at 10:30 on Zoom. And finally, I'd like to introduce our guest preacher for today. Many of you know Reverend Ray Schellinger. Ray has joined us before, and he helped to lead our Advent study on asylum seekers and refugees. Ray has been a global servant with American Baptist International Ministries for many years. He is currently the International Ministries Global Consultant for Immigrants and Refugees. And in that role, he networks with IM colleagues and international partners that serve with refugees and displaced peoples, helping to strengthen their ministries, find needed resources, and build capacity. In addition to that, Ray hosts several teams each year in international cross-cultural settings where they can learn about the struggles of migrants, the realities of global immigration, and border policies. I am personally indebted to Ray for two reasons. Well, actually a lot more than two, but let's just name two today. Ray introduced me to and nurtured my love of tacos, and Ray introduced me to my husband, Josh, and performed our wedding ceremony. So I am indebted to Ray for that, and I'm so glad that he can be with you this morning while I am away, and blessings on your time together. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Good morning. Please join in this call to worship by Reverend Mindy Welton Mitchell by reading aloud the bold print. Hearts open, we enter this space, recalling how much we are loved. Minds open, we enter this space, receiving God's wisdom and insight. Arms open, we enter this space, ready to share God's love in word and deed. Lives open, we enter this space, being transformed by God's love, wisdom, and work.
Worthy of forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Come walk among us. Come walk among us, Jesus. You know that we need you. Know that we need you, Jesus. You see our hearts. You know that we're formed from dust. It's you who made us, Lord, in you we choose to trust. Come, Lord, come, Lord. Come walk among us. Come walk among us, Jesus. Know that we love you. Know that we love you, Jesus. You see our hearts. You know that we're formed from dust. It's you who made us. Lord, in you we choose to trust. Come, Lord, come, Lord, come, You see our hearts. You know that we're born from dust. It's you who made us. Lord, in you we choose to trust. Come, Lord, come, Lord, come, Lord, come,
The scripture reading is Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 19. Cursed be anyone who deprives the alien, the orphan, and the widow of justice. All the people shall say, Amen.
My dear friends at Royersford Baptist Church, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, even if it's only on Zoom. I hope that someday, and very, very soon, I'll be able to see you face to face. As I begin today, I want to share with you some of the challenges that we're facing throughout the world. Now, as you, I'm sure, are aware, There are tens of thousands of Afghan refugees that the United States is currently in the midst of finding a way to invite and welcome into the United States. We've got churches and communities that are coming together to sponsor more than 50,000 Afghan refugees who will be coming on humanitarian parole, which means that they're going to need sponsors and they're not going to be receiving any government benefits, so the needs will be much greater. And then 15 to 20,000 other Afghan refugees who are actually being sponsored by the government will have some support. But in every case, they're going to need communities where they are welcome to come into and where people will come together to make them feel as good as we possibly can. In addition to those displaced people, right now there are an additional 82.4 million forcibly displaced people throughout our world. 48 million of those are internally displaced within their own countries. 26.4 million are recognized refugees by UNHCR, currently seeking to find ways to resettle them in other places. There are 4.1 million asylum seekers who have reached other countries where they're hoping that they will be granted asylum. And there's another category, 3.9 million Venezuelans who are displaced abroad. Most of them are in Colombia and other countries in South America. Mostly now they are traveling throughout South America looking for somewhere where they can stay, somewhere where they can live. The majority of refugees and displaced people in our world right now come from Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And the countries that are hosting them in the greatest numbers are Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany. In 2020, only 34,000 of these 80-some thousand displaced people, 34,000 people were resettled through UNHCR, less than 12,000 in the US. That's down from a height of about 130,000 that we accepted just 5 years ago. And certainly a lot short of the numbers that we'd like to see. At one point, the United States led the world in our refugee resettlement efforts, but unfortunately, that number's gone way down, and we need to figure out a way to rebuild our capacity to bring people in. And that's something we're going to need a lot of help from churches, and I'm hoping Royersford as well. That's something I'm hoping that we can talk about as we have a discussion after the service. Well, I've been so perplexed by some of the things I'm hearing from people, as I mentioned before. Every time I say something about immigration, I get this pushback. And you hear the same refrains again and again. One, for instance, people say, I'm in favor of immigrants as long as they come legally. Well, I'd like to share with you some of the obstacles that have existed for asylum seekers as they try to come legally into the US. And I think the best way to do that is talk to you about some of the stories and the obstacles that each of these people have encountered. Now, you all know Benson and Dennis, two asylum seekers who are currently living in my house, much, much longer than we had anticipated. And it might be for a much more longer period of time to come. Benson, escaped 2 attempts on his life by the vice president of the country because he had denounced corruption at the highest levels. He escaped finally his way through South America up to Mexico to apply at the US border for asylum, thinking the United States would be the answer. Unfortunately, the journey has not been that good. In fact, it's been much harder on him once he arrived to the US. The first thing that any asylum seeker has encountered in the last couple of years at the border was a metering system. We put this in place after a large number of Haitians came from Brazil in 2016. The US felt that it couldn't handle the thousands of people that were arriving, and so they created a list and made people wait, taking about 25 to 30 people per day at each of its border crossings. And so this meant a wait of many years for some people. For Benson, it was a wait of about 7 months before he was able to come to the border and apply. And when he did, the first thing he was met with was the icebox. And this is the thing that every single asylum seeker will tell you about. It's a cold room, concrete, where you're put in with about 25 other people in a very, very small room, and you're kept there for 3 or 4 days. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, one toilet in the room, which is out in the open. People sleep on the floor, but you have to sleep in shifts because there isn't enough space on the floor. Lights are on 24/7, and the room is kept at 51 degrees. That's Benson's first impression of the US, being shoved into that. And then when he asked questions about why, he was punched and forced and pushed down onto the ground. After several days in the icebox, he was able to come and apply for asylum, at which point, after a credible fear interview, he was placed into detention. He was moved from one place to another and spent ultimately 14 months in detention. More than the last year was in Louisiana. We tend to put a lot of our asylum seekers in detention in Louisiana. In fact, I think almost half of them are there, and other places where the immigration courts tend to be very conservative and anti-immigrant. In fact, about half of our immigration detention beds of the 45,000 that we have are in Louisiana. And the rate of approval, asylum approvals there is less than 5%. And so Benson went there, explained his case while he was escaping political persecution for having denounced a $700 million, bribery, dam contract, issue happening in Kenya. And explains all this and says that he's being persecuted. He shows where he was stabbed in the hospital, and all the hospital records about being there for several weeks, placed in prison, and how his driver the car that he was supposed to be driving in was riddled with more than 150 bullets, and his best friend and driver were killed. He explains all of this, and they deny him. After several months, as this case goes through, he's ultimately denied. And begins to seek an appeal. Finally, after 14 months in detention, we were able to get him released to my sponsorship and to live here at my house. And Benson just found out that his appeal this past week was denied by the Board of Immigration Appeals. He has very, very few options left, and nothing that looks very promising. And so unfortunately for Benson, we're going to have to look for some other options. We don't think that ICE can deport him because he can prove that his life is in danger, although he didn't meet the criteria that our government considers to be a victim for the 5 reasons that they give, because he was being targeted by members of his own party and not for being in an opposition party. And so we don't know what will happen. We're thinking maybe we might have to find a way for him to go to Canada or maybe a country in Europe. We don't know. But that's kind of what Benson's had to face. That's somebody doing it the legal way. Dennis is another example of that. Here's somebody who is applying for asylum because he was a victim of political persecution for having organized pro-democracy rallies and anti-Putin rallies and being an opposition candidate at the municipal level in Moscow. They detained him, they beat him, they fined him and frozen all of his assets, and he fled just before he was to be arrested. Hundreds of other people from Team Navalny, with whom he worked, have met the same fate. They've had to leave. Others have been detained. Some have been killed. And yet, Dennis makes it to Mexico, one of the few countries where he could fly to without a visa. From Moscow, just in the nick of time. He comes, applies, waits 7 months before he can cross the border. When he finally does, of course, he's put immediately into detention. And 7 months later, he was released with a $10,000 bond to my sponsorship here at my house. And he still waits. He wants to be able to apply for work, but for some reason, the 6 months that they require once they've accepted your documents for your asylum application. You're supposed to be able to apply for work authorization in 6 months. And for some reason, they've never formally accepted his asylum application. He's in the system, but they just stop the clock. And this happens for hundreds of people, that they refuse to keep the clock running because he changed the venue from being in prison in California to Pennsylvania. And although he will most likely have a favorable hearing, he can't work until that point, and they're telling us now that it could be another 6 months, a year, 2 years before he will, because there's such a backlog of asylum applications, before it would be heard. And in that time, Dennis is doing nothing. He can't do anything. He can't work legally anywhere. And so he's waiting and waiting and waiting. But Dennis and Benson are the lucky ones. A woman I met this past year in just over a year and a half ago in Tijuana, Juanita, with 3 kids, met her at one of the border shelters that we work with through one of our Baptist churches. She came and waited for her turn. She's one of the 100,000 Central Americans who, after waiting for their turn through the metering process, were able to apply for asylum, come through, go through the ICE box, only to be returned to Mexico under the Migrant Protection Protocol, which does nothing to do to protect migrants in any way. Every 2 months, she was forced to gather our belongings, leave the shelter, go to the border in hopes that this will be the opportunity for her to apply, each time only to be told that she needs to return and continue to wait. And most of those people returned and returned and returned once again for 6 months, 8 months, a year. In her case, it was 14 months. For her 7th appointment, she went to the border. And because the US authorities gave the name with the 2 last names reversed, to the Mexican authorities when she arrived to the border, they wouldn't let her cross and apply. They wouldn't let her keep her appointment. Most of the people under MPP have been denied asylum because they weren't able to make their appointments. Hundreds of people were denied because the names were spelt wrong. And the Mexican authorities were told they shouldn't let anybody in unless the name matched exactly. And so she was denied, and she was told that she'd have to wait 10 more years before she can apply again. And this is what MPP does. It limits your access to a lawyer. It keeps you waiting in Mexico to keep going through this process in hopes that most people will lose patience and leave, that they won't be able to make their appointments. And the truth is that less than 2% have. Less than 2% of MPP applicants have been granted asylum. And now, after COVID began, the whole MPP process is on hold, and most of the people in MPP have had to continue to wait for an extra year and a half without any appointments at all. Well, since 2020, because of COVID and Title 42, the US has refused to allow anyone to apply for asylum. So even if you come to the border and you try to cross, even if you cross between ports of entry, you're returned immediately and told that you cannot apply and you have to continue to wait. So the US has, detained and returned some of the largest numbers of people trying to cross the border illegally over the last couple months, larger numbers than they've ever seen before. And some people say this is a disgrace, and they see the big pictures of all these people amassed on the border on both sides and saying, what is the government doing to close the border? Why is this happening? And they blame it on the new administration because they haven't closed the border. They haven't cracked down on all these people trying to cross. And I think they have it all wrong. They do have it all wrong. The border is closed. These people are not getting through. They're being turned back immediately. They're right, however, in that this is a disgrace. It's the evidence of the desperation of a several-year logjam of innocent people who have not even been able to ask for asylum when they've come to our door. And so to you, those who say that they're in favor of immigration as long as it's legal, I must ask, why have we not done anything to find a way to allow the truly deserving to find refuge here? I'm not advocating that we let everyone in, but just that we find a humanitarian instead of a military solution to the problems that our neighbors are facing. Another thing that I hear a lot, that we can't spend our limited resources to help anybody else as long as we have homeless veterans here in the United States. Well, first, let me remind you that America First is theological heresy, and the idea that we need to help our own before we can help anybody else is completely heretical. I've heard this 1,000 times, but rarely from anybody that is actually doing anything to help homeless vets, or to help homeless people or vets or, anybody. In fact, the people that I know that are actually doing the most to help homeless vets and homeless people and vets tend to be people that are also in favor of helping immigrants too. I wonder why that is. But the good news is that we have all we need to do something about all of these problems. Just to let you in on a little secret, we have a lot of money. As a nation, we have the highest level of wealth ever accumulated in the history of the world. In fact, the US has just 5% of the world's population. We hold 30% of the world's wealth. We should be able to help a lot of homeless vets with that, right? Perhaps some migrants too. But the bad news is that just as the world's wealth is concentrated among a few countries, the US's wealth is also highly concentrated in the hands of a small minority of people. We have one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world, and this has nothing to do with magical, mythical beings who can grant us wishes. The Gini coefficient is a measure of how well the wealth of a nation is distributed among its citizens. In a completely equal society, the Gini would be 0. In a completely skewed society with one individual holding all the wealth, the Gini is 100. In the US, 85, right up there with Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Perhaps we will not ever find a way to ensure the well-being of our neighbors as long as we continue to support a system in which such iniquities exist unquestioned and are only strengthened by the political systems that we put in place and where the poorest of the poor are always pitted against one another. Finally, the third thing I want to mention that I hear all the time, the concern, the command to welcome the stranger is found dozens of times in the Bible, both Old Testament and New. We need to welcome ger, the ger, but who is the ger? That's translated often as stranger, alien, foreigner, sojourner, exile, refugee, asylum seeker, immigrant. But the question also arises, well, who exactly are we talking about? Who is the ger? And there's a current trend among conservative Christians to interpret this as only the legal immigrant, and not all those who have come without documents or authorization, or who would like to come and haven't been able to come yet. I hear this a lot, and I see these people in the same light that I imagine Jesus saw the young teacher who asked him, but who is my neighbor? In some ways, it functions to deny any responsibility for those that are here that we don't feel deserve to be here, while at the same time limiting any responsibility we might feel otherwise to open the legal channels for more people to come. The idea is closely aligned with those that would say that people coming to us from places, not Norway or Sweden, but Kenyans, Afghans, Haitians, they're undesirable because they come from shithole nations. And I hope you forgive me the use of the word, but I implore you to understand that the profanity here isn't in the use of the word, but perhaps it's in believing the ideas behind that expression. In Revelation 3, Jesus says, and to the angel of the church in Laodicea write the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the origin of God's creation. I know your works. You're neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were either cold or hot, but because you are lukewarm, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. You do not realize that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked. Therefore, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire so that you may be rich, and white robes to clothe you and to keep the shame of your nakedness from being seen, and salve to anoint your eyes so that you may see. I reprove and discipline those whom I love. Be earnest, therefore, and repent. Listen, I am standing at the door knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come into you and eat with you and you with me. I think I remember that Jesus also said, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. Whatever you refused to do for the least of these, you refused to do for me. In the last several years, I've met hundreds, thousands of people who are standing at the door and knocking. And I just wonder if we might be able to hear Jesus's voice and theirs as they ask for a place to come in. And if we might remember, behold, I stand at the door and knock.
Be not dismayed where'er they tide, God will take care of you. Beneath his wings of love abide, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day or all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you. Through toil when your heart doth fail, God will take care of you. When dangers fierce your path assail, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day or all the way. He will take care of you. God will take care of you. No matter what may be the test, God will take care of you. Lean, weary one upon his breast, God will take care of you.